Welcome, everyone. I'm really glad you all joined us today for SID's Private Sector Engagement Panel. My name is Roger Ford, and I've had the honor of serving on this year's annual conference committee. I'm also a managing director with Accenture Development Partnerships, Accenture's international development practice, which focuses on driving development impact by applying innovation, technology, and market-based solutions to help progress the SDGs around the globe. Today's topic is a very important one. As the world continues to grapple with the impacts of COVID-19, we will continue to realize that the pandemic's full impact on global poverty rates and setbacks in achieving the SDGs will sadly come to the forefront. To mitigate these setbacks now more than ever, we must come together across the sectors globally. Private, civil society, governments will need to unite and advance development through shared interests and environmental, social, and governance goals, better known as ESG. ESG is a very promising trend which has made companies and the private sector focus more than ever on the impact beyond profit growth, and has allowed us to look for opportunities to ultimately satisfy the interests of investors, customers, and employees. Ultimately, we hope that ESG will accelerate private sector engagement and advance the SDGs in spite of COVID setbacks and deliver on the promise of equitable growth around the globe. To further explore this important and fascinating topic, we've convened a distinguished panel of experts facilitated by Jane Nelson. Jane is the Director of Corporate Responsibility Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. We look forward to exploring this topic through Jane's moderation of this panel. And with that, Jane, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. No, thank you very much, Roger. And add my very warm greetings to everyone who is joining us for this discussion on, as Roger says, the increasingly important role of private sector engagement. And I think the leadership challenge is absolutely clear in that despite the very impressive progress that many individual companies have made, many companies working together and with others have made over the past couple of decades, we're falling seriously behind. And I would argue we were falling behind even before the humanitarian and very devastating humanitarian and economic impacts of the pandemic, and even more so now. And so simply put, as a global community, as local communities, we are simply not achieving either the speed or the scale or the systems level change that is really needed to achieve the sustainable development goals, and particularly to address the global climate emergency and address some of the fundamental challenges we currently face in terms of all types of structural injustice and inequality. And so how do we increase the speed and the scale and the systemic impact, and particularly of the role of the private sector? And there are two key themes that we're going to discuss with our panel today. First of all, how do we mainstream and actually turbocharge ESG or sustainability within companies and within their core business practices, their corporate strategies, even in their business models, and particularly in the way companies are investing and innovating in new technologies, products, and services. So that sort of internal element of really making sure that all the capabilities and capacities of companies are behind this agenda in a way that makes sense commercially for them. And then secondly, how do we achieve what one of our panelists wonderfully calls radical collaboration? How do we move beyond project-based type partnerships to much larger scale alliances which really have the impact to address challenges and obstacles at the systems level? So those are our two key questions that we're going to discuss in the next 45 minutes that we have. And we have a wonderful panel to help guide us on this. I will just mention their titles. Their impressive backgrounds and experiences is in the conference catalogue. But firstly, Hala Thomas-Dotter, who is the CEO and Chief Change Catalyst at the B team, which is itself a wonderful group and collective action of companies and leaders, business leaders. Steve Schmida, who is the co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer at Resonance, which is a leading global development and corporate sustainability consulting firm. Anne Stake, who is the head of strategy, innovation and technology at Medtronic Labs. And last but certainly not least, Carmen Villar, who is the vice president, social business innovation in the policy communications and public health team or population health team at Merck. So for wonderful panelists, without further ado, I want to dive into the first sort of topic of discussion in terms of how do we really embed this and turbocharge it within companies. And Hala and Steve, maybe if we could start with the two of you, because you see sort of a wide cross-section of companies across different sectors and different geographies. Where do you see some of the major and progress best practices in terms of mobilizing real action and scale at the company level? And Hala, maybe we can start with you.
Certainly. Thanks you, Jane, and thank you, Roger, and everyone for joining a very important conversation at a time like no other in our lifetime. It is certainly an extraordinary moment for leadership to rise, but it needs to look different. And B Team was really founded around this idea that we needed to shift the definition of success in business to incorporate the well-being of people and our only home, the planet, as well as exercising good governance to get there. So I think I am privileged to work with companies and leaders who've been on this journey maybe a little bit longer than most. But what I'm really encouraged by is that I think even with all the hardship we have experienced over the last year, it feels like it has also brought an acceleration of shifting norms in the direction that we've been working towards for a long time. And it excites me to witness that there is actually momentum that I think can meet and make up for the shortcomings and certainly the setbacks that we've seen from this year. And I'm not minimizing the challenge to remain optimistic here today, but let me just name a few examples, Jane. Just this last week, we saw a group of Nordic CEOs stand up and say TCFD on climate disclosures needs to be part of the agenda. So really backing that loudly. We also saw Wall Street and the courts raise their muscle towards the fossil fuel industry in very visible ways. And we saw the largest global private equity company, KKR, one of the leading ones, buy an ESG consultancy in the UK. And over the past year, we've seen a quadruple of funding go into an ESG direction. So I would point to all of this as saying momentum is definitely shifting. It is fast becoming the expectation or not the exception that CEOs and boardrooms put ESG on the agenda. Now, this is, and the next generation has been asking for it for a long time, not just during the last year. The employees, investors, consumers of the next generation, they've known it, but it's like we heard them over the last year. It's like we're awake, and now we heard them. Now, the challenge, because I'm not just going to be a radical optimist, even if I believe we have to be right now, is that we do not have enough harmonization or high enough of an ambition in measuring what really matters. So right now, we have designed a system that measures the maximization of shareholder wealth for the short term, and yet are asking and expecting CEOs to do all these other things. And it's a bit of a jungle for leaders to navigate. What does good look like? How do I get started? What is the expectation I'm set to meet? And there, I think the most hopeful thing I see out there, Jane, is that the IFRS Foundation is going to be launching a sustainability standards board. I think they're going to launch it at COP, and I think they're going to come together around a global ESG standard. And I think this will be critical to resetting or writing the rules that business operates by and helping us achieve true accountability, because there is still purpose washing out there. There is still greenwashing. There is still pink washing. There's still a lot of efforts that are more about PR than equity and truly creating a just and inclusive transition to a better world that as human beings we all want.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Helen. I think sort of a great start in terms of these key drivers, be it clearly the investor community, increasingly the regulatory community, and the courts, certainly employees expecting and demanding more, and one of the biggest challenges being the metrics and harmonization on how we measure success and ensure accountability, and a key area where we need radical collaboration, as we're starting to see. Yeah, see from your perspective, what are you seeing, particularly at the company level in terms of good practice?
I mean, I think we're seeing it. I have to totally agree. I mean, I think we're seeing a sea change, right? When we look across our clients, and we work with both donor agencies, but also with corporate clients, a lot of the leading Fortune 500 companies, we're seeing conversations inside those companies that frankly would have been shocking, well, surprising 2 years ago and shocking 5 to 10 years ago. And I think, one area that really is worth all of us digging into, that both Hala and you touched upon, is this issue around employees and talent. What we're seeing sort of very consistently across the board, yes, there are these ESG drivers, but if you really dig under what a lot of companies are, what's really keeping them up at night, it's the war for talent, and that talent wants purpose, right? They're increasingly demanding it. And especially what I would say, and this is just the nature of the way things are right now, the top 10% of talent can have a huge impact on the company's bottom line. So companies are very, very aggressively listening to that talent pool, trying to figure out ways to attract more of those types of folks. But also, it's a unique moment where I think employees have a very compelling voice, whether that's around equity and inclusion, right? We've seen quite a bit of activism by employees in the tech sector and a number of areas, but also, in things like climate, right? I think if you were to ask Satya Nadella why, Microsoft's committing to going carbon negative, I mean, he would probably eventually get to the point of like, yes, we want to attract the very best talent, right? And it's really important to our workforce. And so that's just something I think sometimes gets lost on the development community a little bit, is how important this is for employees inside these companies who may have the same purpose as you do in the development community, even as they're working in more traditional industries.
And before coming to Anne and Carmen, can I just ask both of you, what sort of specific good practices are you seeing in the companies you work with around the talent agenda? So there's one thing to listen to the talent. What are the opportunities to make sure that the voice of employees is more heard in a more consistent way? Is it business resource groups? Is it enabling employees to go and work with nonprofit organizations and development organizations? What are some of the good practices you're both seeing?
Just real quick, and I'll let Hala, she probably has a lot more to say about this, but I would say we're seeing a lot of focus on science-based targets, which again, we're talking about talent that understands what those targets are and what they mean. And so that would be one thing that we've seen. And then I think the other thing we're seeing is, it's not in every industry, but an increasing emphasis on how do we figure out the circularity? How do we get circular business models going? Because that's something where employees, I think, have a lot of influence because they're designing and manufacturing a lot of these products.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And being able to combine sort of scientific expertise with interpersonal skills and capabilities is, I think, a big leadership development challenge. Yeah, Hala.
Well, I think because we're talking about accelerating a norm shift, and the next generation has almost already had that acceleration of norm shifts, and yet the boardrooms and some of the leadership we have is still a little stuck in the crisis of conformity, to be honest. So some of the most innovative things I'm seeing actually is, for example, Allianz, one of the B-Team companies, it hosts an ESG meeting with the next generation once a year. So board directors bring their children in to ask challenging questions. Very powerful to understand what's happening out there. IKEA, another B-Team company, having intergenerational dialogues with not just its own leadership, but CEOs from around the world and climate activist children from the street. I just think it's a real reality check, whether it's around our own dinner table when we speak to our children or grandchildren, or bringing in sort of these next generations of talent. And if you really focus on making that diverse across the lines of gender and race and even globally where people come from, I think the issues you need to see become more real, and your ability to solve them as a leader today becomes more realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And as both you're pointing out, doing it on a consistent, regular basis, not just a one-off meeting here or there. And so setting those institutional mechanisms in place to make it happen and the incentives to make it happen. Great. Well, Anne, if we can come to you and then Carmen on, you're actually in the heart of companies, making it work internally. I mean, what are some of the things that you're most excited about, sort of seeing where your companies are going? In really turbocharging the commitment to sustainability and ESG.
Absolutely. Well, picking up quickly on the talent conversation, actually, Medtronic Labs, where I work, which is the global health arm of Medtronic, actually started out as very small experiments about 10 years ago within the business units at Medtronic. After the former CEO, Omar Ishrak, challenged all of the different business units to figure out how we could expand access to healthcare for underserved patients around the world that don't have access to the Medtronic technology. And today we're a completely, separate entity, but, funded by Medtronic. We have a public benefit corporation, a 501c3, and entities in Kenya, India, Ghana, in the Philippines, over 150 employees. And, all of that started because of passion and commitment from employees within the companies or within the business units. The other thing maybe I'll just mention on the ESG front, Medtronic has been focused on purpose, core to its mission ever since it was founded with the first pacemaker. And that's really been kind of a through line throughout every CEO at Medtronic ever since, and that's no exception today. I do think, though, that it is critical to not just consider ESG as a box checking or reporting exercise. And that's what I'm most excited about with some of the conversations we've been having at Medtronic, in particular, around how we set targets globally for the company, but then how it actually translates into strategies with, actual collaboration with the leaders of every business unit, with Medtronic Labs, the global health arm, the foundation, to, actually translate those strategies into actions and hopefully results. To make sure that we're actually accountable. So to highlight maybe something that we're doing in the S category of ESG in the next few years, I think you'll see Medtronic really focused on health equity. So every operating unit at the company has a dedicated health equity team. And at Medtronic Labs, we've set, very bold target to expand access and improve health for 25 million people by 2025. So, looking to be held accountable. And then, one other comment, picking up on some of the conversations that Hala was highlighting, what's really exciting to me is that, Medtronic and, the conversations we're having have really progressed in the past few years beyond what I would consider typical corporate conversations. So we've been thinking about how we can actually actualize some of the trends and, the buzzword around stakeholder capitalism. How can we actually be part of making that a real thing? We've been talking about, advocating for public, mandatory, and standardized ESG reporting. And I think that's one thing Hala was mentioning. And then really looking at how we are held accountable as corporations. I was reading that 80% of targets that we set aren't achieved, and so let's how can we make sure we are actually working with governments and making those targets accountable? And then third, just really on government and making sure that this isn't just solely market-based approaches, but that we're able to engage with government as partners, but then also look at what regulations need to be in place to fix the real market failures that do exist, because we acknowledge that too.
Great. No, well, thank you. And I think at least sort of three really key things there that are relevant for anyone listening, and I think any company. One is, as you say, not only having that purpose, but making sure that the purpose is embedded in strategy and strategy planning, business planning, incentive systems, mechanisms, etc. And that the structures are there, to listen to employees. That institutional mechanism of setting up venture funds or separate units, how does one mainstream to the entire business, but also enable sort of ring fencing real innovation, particularly when it might not have an immediately hurdle rate of traditional commercial hurdle rates, and then that sort of setting ambitious public goals and holding oneself to accountable to them, I think are sort of three of the key themes that define leadership. And then plus the fourth one, that advocacy piece. I think thinking about public policy advocacy is a key thing that companies do, and how can companies have progressive policy advocacy. So thanks for those great examples, Anne. Carmen, some thoughts from the Merck side?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me today, Jane. I always think I'm gonna come and see you and take one of your courses and meet you in person. So it's so nice to see you on the video. Let me just start by saying that at Merck, we're fortunate that our corporate purpose has always been reflected in our ethos, right? Our founder, George W. Merck, is famously quoted as saying, "We try never to forget that medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow. And if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear." And I think if you look at our 130 years of operating, and you'll see that we definitely have ups and downs as we follow economic growth and economic lows. And as a company, that is natural. But if you think about our history and our manufacturing of vaccines, I mean, this is one of the greatest public health worldwide inventions ever, right? And we manufacture the majority of the childhood recommended vaccines in the US. And so we're the staff, the employees, we've been talking about purpose. Our scientists come to work with this in mind. This is what they truly believe at heart. And whether, you're cleaning up in the hallways or you're sitting at the lab at the bench, everybody, this is sort of ingrained. And I think is one of our goals in terms of making sure that our ESG ethos is really woven throughout the company. We've, having said that, we've started to see a bit of a shift where it's more of a going from supply to demand, where now it's not just about the employees, our managers and the upper echelons of the company, in light of what's been happening over the last year with COVID and health equity, and really thinking about access to care for health and keeping individuals healthy, they've started to come to us and demand more. It's not us just pushing out, hey, these are great ESG principles, or we're going to report this. They're really saying to us, how can we actually affect change? How can we get better access to health? And I think that's where we really, my small team inside of a large organization has just reorganized itself to really have an entire health equity team sitting above brand, working across our commercial organization to advise and to help them understand that 80% of health outcomes are driven by the social determinants of health, and we can help you understand that, and you can bake that into your marketing approaches and how you reach the end users of these medicines and vaccines. So it's really become more of a demand function, which we're really excited about. Our approach is always, as we've heard today too, a little bit driven by investors, or a lot of it driven by investors. We're seeing that shift happen, but we're also seeing in the investor community more demand for what does your ESG portfolio look like? Is it really baked into the entire operations of your company? And I think that we need, especially, I know it's a global audience today, but in the US, and Paula talked about standards on the global level. The U.S. is also, has appointed a really important ESG lead at the SEC for the government, looking at how companies are operating inside the U.S. And I'm sure thinking about a lot of the same issues that we're thinking about on the global stage. I think, in terms of measuring our performance and incentives, and we've been reporting on our progress and performance in this area, whether it's corporate responsibility or ESG or whatever we call it, since 2006. And I think more specifically, over the last 2 years, we've generated a standalone ESG progress report targeted to investors to make it easier for them to sort of pick out the bits and pieces that they're interested, whether they're using it to evaluate us as a business or measure us in an index, or whether to invest in us. They have that readily available, and they don't have to sort of go through a bunch of narrative and great stories, which are important, but sometimes you don't have time to do that. And I think we're also looking at transparency and ESG accountability. We've spoken to our executive committee about how we better tie performance in the ESG space to to our incentives and compensation. So I think we're really looking at all levels of the company about how we can help and support our front lines, people who are out there every day, understanding what's happening in the healthcare world, all the way up to our C-suite, saying, how can we hold ourselves accountable and our employees accountable as a company that has this long history, but can always do better.
Great, no, thanks, Carmen. I think again, a sort of great sort of picture in my mind of almost sort of the skeleton structure of a company, and making sure that ESG is part of the entire architecture, from the board, right down to product development and implementation.
And even procurement. I mean, we're looking at diverse suppliers. We're part of the $1 billion roundtable. We're doing great, but we can always do better, right? We can always look out there in the ecosystem and say, where is it that we've missed? How can we improve in this area? And I think, as we move along in this discussion, we can talk more about partnership and how critical it is to that piece.
Great, and I think it's a great sort of segue. And one of the questions we've got is that the private sector is not just the big multinationals; it's also farmer cooperatives, agri-entrepreneurs, other social entrepreneurs, and trying to address issues of education, human rights organizations, etc. So I think it would be good to shift now to, if we're beginning to get it right at the company level, and I think seeing that important shift of ESG being embedded into all of the key functions and levels of the companies that are serious and their stakeholder engagement, but also companies, and you've both, Anne and Carmen, given great examples, and I think IKEA is another, of starting to explicitly and publicly address systems level challenges. I mean, health equity is as complex an ecosystem as you can find, and so it would be really interesting to hear from all four of you, and Hala, maybe we can start with you again. What are some of these sort of large scale system level alliances you're seeing that are trying to drive the systems change, whether it's on accountability, human rights, education, or health, or other system challenges? Hala.
Thank you, Jane, and all of you for such valuable contributions. I think before I mention specific examples, I would just like to uplift that it's ultimately about leadership rather than the measures, because we can have the right metrics, but the wrong leadership. And we can also have the right leadership in a system that uses the wrong metrics. So we can't talk about one really without the other. But one of the sort of aha moments for me has been, and the B team has really gotten behind this, is that most of our issues, if not all, are interdependent. So we need holistic leadership now. For example, a lot of people still don't understand that our refugee and migrant crisis is largely due to climate change. And so we talk about climate change in one silo, and then we talk about climate justice maybe away from it, or justice and equity issues away from it. And at the end of the day, we need a just and inclusive transition for all of humanity towards that greener future that we all know we need. And so I think this is one of the biggest challenges, that we are so siloed, and our business schools and everything we go through in training, and even most of the consulting that leaders get is siloed. And I think that's a real problem. So I just want to say that I think one of the ways that we think about it today is that brave leadership in your own company is no longer enough. So you need brave leadership in your own company, but transformative leadership, which is what this moment is all about, is about bringing others along and being unafraid to tackle the broken system. And so we had a recent experience with one of our B team leaders, CEO of Danone, big global food company. He was one of the best to go to the agri-entrepreneurs and really think about justice and equity, and really learned a lot with another B team leader, Muhammad Yunus, about going to India and meeting the people in the very communities that are impacted by the way big companies often work. And yet recently he was ousted from his seat. And investors are really busy saying, and the board, that it was not about ESG, that they are committed to ESG. And I think that's the good news out of this story. The bad news is that investors are still working in a broken system. So we can't ask for a brave leadership in a broken system. So I think the radical collaboration I'd like to lift up here is that B team, apart with a lot of other business-led organizations, partnered a couple of years ago, but we really came out once COVID hit us and called collectively with grassroots activists from around the world for an economic reset, to actually reset our world so that it works for all of humanity, for our only home, and that it has governance that recognizes our interdependence, our need to invest in justice, because we haven't been doing that, and our need to account for all stakeholders in the way we do business and the way we lead. And this we did on the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's shareholder primacy essay from the New York Times, the infamous essay. And what was interesting, and we saw global leaders standing with artists from the grassroots in Brazil or Africa or India or Asia, all saying we need a reset. And so I think we all agree on the reset, but we have to agree on what we are going to require from those operating within the system. And that has to be to place holistic responsibility for environmental, social, and governance issues alongside profit. Not as a secondary thing, but it's just as important. So we can start measuring what matters. And I think ultimately companies that want to survive this decade are going to have to do it, or they're not going to attract the talent or the customer loyalty or investors who increasingly are aligning their portfolios accordingly. But we need to be 10 times bolder about this than we are now. We can no longer have pet projects and do a little bit of pinkwashing or a little bit of talking about our purpose. We need to get really bold, really radical, and it can no longer be just private sector and civil society and governments working in their own silos. Issues and actors need to come together and recognize their interdependence.
Great, thank you. And so, as you said, the sort of bold statements and advocacy backed by public commitments and accountability at the company level. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. How do we make sure there isn't that mismatch between public policy advocacy by companies and then, let's take equity and then, they're not working on minimum wage or living wage. So, how does one make sure there's that consistency? I think is crucial. So, but the collective policy advocacy for things like an economic reset, great examples. Steve, where are other areas where you think sort of collective action can have a real impact on sort of the?
I think Jane, the area I would like to talk a bit about is the development community itself. And look, I think the development community has made huge progress in the last 15 years. So when I set up Resonance to go out and do public-private partnerships and cross-sector collaboration 15 years ago, I was pretty much laughed out of every development conversation there was, with a very few exceptions. And there were some early folks who early adopters, as there always are. But the development community has made big strides of sort of trying to figure out ways to better engage. But I think as we look forward, I think the development community actually has to do some inward looking, right? Our agencies, the donor agencies themselves, were mostly set up in the 1960s, and with sort of policies and procedures probably written mostly in the 1970s, right? And they're just, our folks in the donor agencies are really hamstrung by this sort of old, very public-led development approach, right? That's sort of baked in to the way the organizations operate. And I think what I've been really pleased to see over the last several months, for example, with the incoming Biden administration and with folks at USAID, is this real serious commitment about doing the very hard, but not very glamorous work of improving internal systems and processes so that companies, when they do start to work with donors and development actors, have can navigate it, can find their way, and maybe get to know or get to yes more quickly, right? It shouldn't be 18 months from the first discussion before a partnership comes together. And I think as we look, it's good to see USAID at sort of the macro level, but many of us work in companies and NGOs and so forth that are involved in development. We also have to think about our tools and our methodologies, right? Workforce development for 5 decades in international development has been a public sector led thing, even though the number one consumer of workforce development is the private sector, right? They're the ones employing folks. And can we use the tools we've developed, but reframe them in ways that make it easier for the private sector to really engage at scale, to me, that is the challenge, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we're headed in the right direction. I'm a cautious optimist.
And I think, the analogy of both Anne and Carmen's teams, at Medtronic Labs and Merck, the companies are developing the internal structures to be better fit for purpose to engage with the development community. The development community increasingly needs to do the same. So we can have a shared vision and common purpose for change, but what are, again, the structural mechanisms at the operational level to make it work? So I think that's a good call to action. And sort of thoughts from your side on large scale systems change.
Yeah, absolutely. And, first, I couldn't agree more with what Hala was saying about the need for this global level economic shift. But maybe taking it down to what I work on day to day to make it a little bit more concrete, I can give you maybe one example of an actual public-private partnership that we've been working on over the past few years that we think is a good example, and maybe one that might inspire others, and one that we're definitely looking to expand in the next few years. So in 2019, Medtronic Labs partnered with the Ministry of Health in Kenya, 5 different county governments, and Novartis Global Health to create an initiative called Afya Dumu, focused on actually delivering primary healthcare with a focus on non-communicable diseases to patients on the ground across these counties. And the way it worked was essentially that we engaged with the national level Ministry of Health to understand what their priorities were from the very beginning, understood the non-communicable disease guidelines that they've set out in their goals, and then worked with them to really shape a kind of system level program. And Medtronic Labs, we brought in the digital technology system, the service model that addresses patient needs, and field operations. The Ministry of Health, of course, provided the oversight. The 3 county governments actually provided all of the health system backbone, the clinicians, the community health workers, and Novartis provided access to their low-cost medications. And as a result, we've been able, while it's relatively small right now, we are managing around 30,000 patients. Over the next few years, we're looking to work with 10 different governments to expand our partnership with Novartis in the same approach. And we see this kind of as a key strategy moving forward. And one thing to mention around like the sustainability side and the government side, after the first year, we were really excited because 2 of the counties decided to take this on by themselves and incorporate it into their system. And the national level Kenya EMR, which they're rolling out, we're working with them to just incorporate all of the digital health solutions that we've been working on into their Kenya EMR and have them take it forward. So that's one example maybe of radical collaboration, even though it's early, and hopefully we'll do more creative partnerships like this in the future.
Great. No, I think a fantastic example. Hala's call to action to have a holistic approach and break down silos. I think that's a brilliant example of both breaking down health silos as well as sort of sector silos in the approach that you've taken. And then there's probably no greater scaling impact we can have than to get government then to adopt some of the approaches and mainstream it even more than a company can. So thanks. And Carmen, come to you, and we'll unfortunately then have to start wrapping up. But
sure, I just want to make 2 quick points, and then I want to address one of the comments that Steve made, if I could. I think, like I said before, we've been investing in unique partnerships for a long time. If you think about our efforts to our commitment to eliminate river blindness globally, one that really stands out as sort of a big and bold commitment and partnership is around our Merck for Mothers program, our MSD for Mothers, as it's called outside of the US and Canada, and really embodies these elements, right? 10 years ago, we made this big, bold commitment to try to address maternal mortality with a $500 million 10-year commitment. And I think, we've reached over 13 million women. We've created coalitions. We've partnered with everybody from, the World Bank to some smaller private clinics and NGOs. And, we've really made progress for healthier moms and safer deliveries and so forth. So I think that's been an excellent collaboration and partnership and big, bold initiative. I think, though, if you look at business and how we operate, what do we need to do there to create some of these unique partnerships, right? And if we think about 2014 and what was happening in West Africa and the Ebola outbreak, we knew that we needed, much like we know today, we need a COVID intervention. We needed something during that outbreak. How were we going to really help people get better? And, there was this vaccine out there that had been, developed by the Public Health Agency of Canada, had been sold to a biotech company in the US, small. And then they said in 2014, well, we have this platform. What do we do with it? We can't afford really to do the kind of work we need it like now. Sold it to Merck, and Merck was able to take it forward as and further develop it with even more partners from across many sectors to get it as an investigational vaccine out to the world, right? And so that is a great model of not only advancing our business, but advancing this social need and this intervention that was really being demanded by society. I think that's a great success story. But we have too few of those. And I think when we talk about the development community, as Steve was bringing this up, I've been privileged in that I've been able to work both at CDC for a long time and in Africa, and also now at Merck. And I can tell you that I often serve as a translator between the two entities. We don't speak to each other well. We don't embrace each other's strengths. We like to focus on the things that really bother us about each other. And we don't enter into each other's domains, right? I mean, I don't know what the census of this meeting looks like right now, but a lot are in the development community or global health or, those kinds of. And so how do we take this conversation into some of the big bio meetings or some of the big, industry meetings or other business venues? And how do we take those conversations into these kind of fora? So I think we like to talk about it. We have some great successes, as both we've just talked about or highlighted. But I think that we really, until we get beyond those barriers and really integrate more and have this boundaryless execution, big, bold ideas with a collective purpose, we're not going to get to where we need to be. And we have to really open our minds and challenge ourselves to do this differently. I don't want to be an interpreter for the next 20 years of my career. I want us to be able to talk to each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's sort of a dual track challenge. How do we nurture and support and incentivize the entrepreneurs and the cross-boundary leaders, but also a real call to action to all of those of us who teach? How do we make sure that, people are being educated and they have work experience that is truly cross-boundary so that we can take more holistic approaches? So it's a very, very important call to action.
Thank you.
Well, I think as we sort of come to wrap up, we've been able to answer a few of the questions. And there's one here in closing comments, if anyone wants to pick up, about the fact that this is all well and good, big governments, big companies working together, but what about, sort of smaller social entrepreneurs, often woman-owned or owned by people of color? What more can we do as business partners to support small-scale entrepreneurs in our partnerships and initiatives? So if you could keep that at your back of your minds, and then also to sort of like to call on each of you, what would be like one or two final key messages, particularly to development partners, on the role that you think business can play or that we can play together in terms of addressing key priorities. Why don't we switch it up a bit? And Steve, why don't I come to you to start?
Sure. Well, maybe addressing that question first. I mean, look, I think there are a number of areas where there's really huge opportunities to collaborate with small scale entrepreneurs and social enterprises. We're currently actually working on a report on social enterprises and corporate supply chains. So we're working on this literally as we speak. It's not quite ready yet, but it'll be out in a few weeks. So that, you know, that's clearly one area where there's a lot of room for engagement. The other area is things around market development, right? A lot of companies are trying to expand in the markets where development actors are playing and where there are amazing entrepreneurs. I mean, I've been involved in dozens of cross-sector partnerships, and I will tell you the most impactful ones I've been involved in have generally involved a local business leader, somebody who really understood and was really committed. And so, you know, I think, you know, when it's easy, you know, this is a US based organization and we're all, you know, it's easy to think that this is about the multinationals and so forth. The multinationals have a big role to play and we shouldn't ignore that. But I think it's in the power of entrepreneurship, the power of local markets and local systems is incredible. And I think where development actors can play a really catalytic role is helping bring supply and demand, bring the two sides together, provide the patient capital, the expertise, that sort of thing. So I encourage folks not to think of private sector engagement as just about the multinationals. I think that's the wrong lens. I think let's be holistic.
Absolutely right, and both holistic in terms of size, but also that you know, local ecosystems and strengthening, whether it's local health systems and local healthcare workers, or local entrepreneurs or local farmers. That, you know, how do you build that local capability is key. So thanks, Steve. Hala.
There's so much to say about these great questions coming in on this conversation. And it's really hard to pick one thing, particularly when you go out and you say we need holistic leadership. But let me start by just saying we need to reset leadership. Leadership is not given only to big companies or those who have big titles or have big jobs. There's leadership in all of us. And every single one of us must now unlock it in service of the greater good. Those of you in development have already decided that. Increasingly, the private sector is awake to that. But I think we are almost killing ourselves from a disease that I don't know any vaccine to, but it's called otherness. We keep othering each other. And so if we can come up with a vaccine to that, Carmen, that would probably be very powerful. And maybe the vaccine is something we are trying and preparing now with a couple of global companies, and it's called a Reset Dialogue and Design Summit. It's actually where a big global company uses its platform to convene multiple stakeholders from their local communities, from their supply chains, from their investor base and boardroom and partners to really reset, whether it's their local community or even more broadly globally, how do we get to shared prosperity on a healthy planet? Because in a low trust world, no one is going to stop the othering until we sit down as human beings. And we need to do that in a very different way. So leadership from above is over. Grassroots leadership alone is not enough. But if we can come together and sort of reset dialogue and design summits at this historical moment, I have every faith that humanity can design a better world. We designed the one we live in. We're facing burned out people on a burned planet, and we're all sort of awake now. We want something better. We want shared prosperity. We want a healthy environment. We want the same things, and we dream of the same things for our children. So if we did this, if we all try to do this wherever we can, there is an absolute hope and reason to be stubbornly optimistic, because science and the innovative capacity of people is there. But maybe tongue in cheek, to be a little fun-loving here, but I mean it too, we could also just put a lot more women and people of different racial backgrounds and different generational geographical backgrounds in leadership. As we say on the B team, change who to change how. And more of the same in the boardroom or in the C-suite is not gonna get us a better, new, more innovative world. So we need to change who to change how, and then we can create the world we both need and want as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And where our institutions and the leadership of our institutions reflect the world and the communities and the nations in which they're operating, which they don't at the moment. Yeah, thank you. Change who to change how. Carmen, closing comments from you.
I love that, Hala. I can't believe you're making me go after Hala because that was so great. I was even writing things down, and I think I've got my charge now. I have to make an othering vaccine. I do think leadership is probably one of our biggest challenges. I really, and I will say from a big corporation point of view, it is so easy to not express your leadership skills because there are so many of you. You're sitting in a meeting and it's not 4 people, it's 14 people. And so pretty soon you're drowned out by others, or you stop caring because somebody else is doing it. And we have to stop that. We have to express our leadership at every level. And I'm sorry to repeat some of this, but I do agree with Hala that by bringing more diversity and inclusion to the fore, we are going to be more successful in doing that. You guys all saw this a week or two ago with the succession plan for JP Morgan Chase versus the succession plan for Morgan Stanley. And I think, you could visibly see the differences in the thinking. And I think, obviously we still have this dichotomy and we have to get out of that. We really have to think more about inclusion in all of the work we do, whether you're in the private sector, or the public sector, or the government, or somewhere else. I mean, this is the only thing I think that's really going to change us. I just wanted to, on the issue around small businesses or minority-owned businesses, we do have a huge supplier diversity effort going on in our procurement arm, and we do we have big summits where folks can listen in or come in person when we can do that and understand better how we procure the tools they need to qualify for those tenders, et cetera, et cetera. So there are tools out there, and I would encourage people to look for those on websites and so forth.
Great, no, great, good mechanisms out there. Anne, final one to you.
Yeah, I mean, this has been fantastic. I'm so inspired by all of the panelists and by you, Jane. I mean, if we're going to address climate change, healthcare, we can't keep addressing them in silos. We're going to have to fundamentally rethink how we measure value in the system. And maybe I'll end with quoting Hala, change who to change how.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a great way to change. It's our rallying cry from this panel. I think just sort of 3 very quick comments on my side. We've talked about we need that change at the institutional level, whether it's within companies or, Steve, your point, within development institutions. And it's how do we get the governance right? How do we get the sort of goals and the metrics right? And then what are the sort of like the business units or the institutional mechanisms that can enable innovation and new types of partnerships to happen at the institutional level, small business, supplier networks, things like that. Absolutely, at the partnership level, I think we've heard some great examples of large-scale partnerships around policy advocacy and changing policies. We've heard some examples around partnerships to get sort of norms and standards agreed, and some great examples around sort of partnerships to either build market-based solutions or sort of health system solutions at a place-based level within a country or a location. But I think, as all of you've said, regardless of what we do at the institutional level or at the sort of interactive partnership level, it ultimately comes down to that individual radical leadership, which is cross-boundary, more inclusive, thinks in a systems way, and can combine, science, technology, and commercial approaches with those broader sort of social goals that are so important for moving forward. So I think ultimately the institutional, the sort of partnership, and the individual leadership is where we need to go, and the change who to change how is where we've got to sort of focus to get there. So thank you very, very much, Steve and Hala and Carmen and Anne. Thanks so much to our organizers and Roger for bringing us together, and look forward to being part of other conversations as we move forward. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.